So what are Power Apps? You might have heard about the Power Platform or Power BI and are wondering where does Power Apps fit into that. Do you know that there are even two types of Power Apps? Yes, you're right, there are Canvas apps and model-driven apps. And in this video, I'm joined by Scott Durow and we cover the details and the components of each of those types of Power Apps. Scott has been a Microsoft MVP since 2013 and has over 2 decades of software engineering experience. He has a deep understanding of the Power Platform and Power Apps, and he's also well known in our Microsoft community. So Power Apps is part of the Power Platform, which is the Microsoft no-code, low-code platform for building custom applications or extending some of the Dynamics 365 apps with additional capabilities. If you want to know more about the Power Platform, take a look at some of my other videos where I go into the details of each of the components of the Power Platform. So let's cover more details about Power Apps. So effectively, Power Apps is made up of two types of Power Apps. There are model-driven apps and Canvas apps. Let's now cover model-driven apps in detail. So we'll go through each of the components of what are model-driven apps made of. So effectively, model-driven apps, the starting point would be really your Dataverse tables, right? So you don't have to have your data model completely ready and finished. You don't have to have all your tables built in before you start in model-driven apps. You can start with a few tables, work in your model-driven apps, and then keep on iterating on your Dataverse tables. So effectively, you would create your Dataverse tables. So in this example, for example, we have the account table, contact table, inquiry tables, and they would kind of form the base of your UI in your model-driven apps, right? So effectively, your tables would render in your left navigation side and would at least start kind of the UI components of your model-driven app, right? So next one, effectively, as we said, so the user interface is predominantly made of those Dataverse tables, and then you can select for each of those tables, you can select the list of the views that you want to include in your model-driven app, right? So for each of those tables, you can create different views or lists. So in this example, I have my account tables with a few columns and rows, and effectively I can create different lists and views for that table, right? So I have a list with all the accounts and a subset of columns, and I have another list with only my accounts with maybe I am the owner and I can select maybe different columns, right? And each of those views can then be linked and selected to be visible within your model-driven app. So you can create a bunch of lists and only select a few to be rendered in your model-driven app, right? So it's kind of selecting the list that you want to display in your model-driven app UI. Next one is forms, right? So forms kind of form the same logic where for your database tables, you will create forms and you can have many different forms. So you can have a main form, you can have a portal form, a second form, a third form. So it doesn't really matter how many forms you have, right? And you have different kind of forms, but effectively, again, you can then select which forms you want to display in your model-driven app, right? So in this case, if you open an account or a record, and then you click on that record, that would open the form, and that form is being so effectively selected to be displayed in your model-driven app, right? And you can have many forms, and if you enable many forms in your model-driven app, you can have a drop-down next to your entity or your table name to select which form you want to render. And a form really shows all the columns or the fields, the sections, kind of related entities, and displayed in a logical manner that kind of form the base of the UI of your form. Then if you continue the user interface, so the navigation, so how the navigation of the user interface is made of. So you can have dashboard. So effectively, if I add a dashboard in my navigation, I can then add and create and show the dashboard that I created. As we discussed, we have our Dataverse tables. So each of these, this is what we covered previously, each of these are our Dataverse tables that can be displayed in the navigation. I can have custom URLs, so I can point from the navigation to external services, external website, external or internal other web applications. And as we discussed previously, briefly, we can also create or have those custom pages, which are kind of taking advantage of what the user interface in Canvas app looks like, where you can really define your UI and play with each of these individual items to kind of create a very specific UI to meet your needs. As part of the user interface, we also have the extension where you can extend effectively the user interface with some additional capabilities. Most of these or some of these require a level of customization and coding. So Scott, could you give us a bit of an understanding of how can you extend the user interface in model-driven?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's certainly more customizable than perhaps people think at first, because like I said, if you've come over from the Canvas app world and you go into the model driven app, it's easy to assume that because you don't have that same flexibility, just to drag things around and enter in Power FX formulas and change colors and borders and all of those kind of things, it's very easy to assume that the model driven user interface is very inflexible. But of course, it's not necessarily the case. I mean, there are quite a lot of extension points, like you point out. So starting from the top on that, I think that there is the first step should always be, can we use custom pages or an embedded Canvas app? Because I think that is always going to get you. That's always going to give you a lot of flexibility to sort of do the things that are easy to maintain, because it's low code and all of those kind of things. But so low code first, before jumping into the sort of the pro code way of doing things, because so if we look at that list, we've got PCF, which is the Power Apps Component Framework. That's a pro code. That's writing controls, user interface controls in TypeScript. You can actually use PCF controls to render a subgrid, a list of records on a form completely differently. You might show a map rather than just a set of records, and you select one of the points, a pin on a map, and it opens up a separate record. Or you might show render a particular process based on the stage that the record is in. So there's all sorts of things you can do with PCF. But a word of caution is that, of course, as soon as you go down that PCF route, as soon as you go down into the pro code route, you are increasing your maintenance costs, obviously, because you need to then start to look after that and make sure it's going to run still work after all the upgrades and all of those kind of things. You've got JavaScript extensions on the form, which enables you to create some custom logic on the form. So, for example, you might want to say when a user selects a certain value in a drop-down, it shows and hides a particular tab or a particular set of fields, that kind of thing. And there is an API that's really rich in terms of the things that you can do, and it's been there for a long time, and it's very mature. Business rules is low code, so it's similar to, like I was just talking about, like when you select a certain value, do an action, except for it's got a user interface that allows you to sort of design your business rule to say, well, when a particular value is set, then you can perform a particular action. But it's certainly not as flexible as JavaScript. So certainly I find myself starting down business rules and saying, hey, I'm going to try and use business rules, and very quickly come up against a blocker because you can't do it, and then you just go back to JavaScript. I think that's quite a common scenario. A command bar Power FX is basically where you would, so all the buttons you have on a model-driven app across the top. And that's one of the things about model-driven apps, is all the actions that you perform on a particular record are always across the top of the form. That's one of the things a lot of people do find somewhat frustrating, unless you've got an action that's going to be applying to a a related record, might be on a subgrid, and maybe some related records on that form, and those commands would exist above that grid wherever it's located. But it's basically running a bit of an expression, is the same sort of expression you would do in a Canvas app. And you might use it to clone a record, or you might use it to set a particular field and then trigger some business logic off the back of that, run a flow, or you might want to have sort of like kind of a custom approval process. Now, you've got PowerFX there against the Power command bar, but you can also run JavaScript on that command bar. So you could actually do some much more complex stuff. And there's a really cool way of showing a custom page as a dialogue, as a pop-up dialogue. So you can kind of have a button that you might say, let's say you want to have a button to say, submit something for approval. And you click that command bar and you open up a custom page. And of course, the custom page is just a Canvas app effectively. You could have some text boxes for like, okay, who are you going to submit it for approval? Maybe a little bit of text, and then a button to say submit, and that could run a Power Automate flow, and then do all that low code goodness. So when you start to do those kind of techniques, it starts to open up and broadens the horizon, and starts to create makes your model driven app start to be actually a lot more customizable than just the standard UI.
Then next we have also some built-in searching capabilities, right? So effectively here you would have a global search, or what we call Dataverse search, where when you type in when you search a record or you search a term, that will search throughout the tables that you have enabled within your model-driven app. You can have quick find. So quick find, if you have selected a table and you have a list of tables, your quick find would effectively here search within that table, right? And then you have advanced find feature, where for each of those tables you can kind of expand. You click on that edit filter, that opens up another page, and then you can kind of go into more advanced searching. So you can search any columns with kind of a criteria, and you can even go and select additional related tables and search for values and columns in those related tables of your kind of parent or main table. Automation, so some automation capabilities in model-driven apps, so plugins where you can call custom code. Could you help us understand what are plugins for?
Yes. Well, yeah, the plugins have been around for a long time, and a lot of people say, why do we even need plugins? I sort of did a little kind of poking the bear type post on LinkedIn a while back to say, okay, give me some reasons why we need plugins. And I just got so many people commenting on it. I was like, wasn't expecting it. And it's clear that lots of people are using them. And the reason that they're using them is that they enable you to extend the platform such that the functionality that you're creating is an extension to the Dataverse layer as though it was native. So anybody that's using your Dataverse tables, you can make sure that all of that interaction goes through your plugin layer. That's what's so powerful about them. So PCF components, code components, is all about pro code for the user interface, whereas plugins is about pro code for the Dataverse database layer, effectively.
Right.
So it's kind of the two sides. So an example of that might be that you want to validate that some particular business rule hasn't been broken. And you may have been doing that in the user interface. That's fine. You may have some JavaScript on your form, or you may have a PCF that's doing that validation, or a business rule that's doing that validation. But then say, for example, somebody now starts to write has a Canvas app or a custom page, or even some external integration that's calling the web API directly, interacting with Dataverse using a web service. Or you may be having users who are doing export to Excel and then imports from Excel, or just importing data in bulk. Those kind of things, merging records, editing data in bulk. There's so many different ways of interacting with the Dataverse data that's not just through that lens of a single form. And that's where plugins are so powerful, because like I said, it creates that sort of gateway. It has to go through that plugin layer. So the plugin can then apply the logic, and it can say, no, sorry, you've broken this particular business rule. You need to correct it before and resend it. It can also do additional things, like when you update a record in a particular way, you might need an audit trail creating in some very specific way, or you may need some other records updating to match the update that's just been created. And again, it doesn't matter where that update's being done; it'll always come through your plugin. But plugins can also be used to create extensions to Dataverse in sense they can create like a custom action that you can call. So when you have a Power Automate flow, you might be familiar with calling a particular action on Dataverse. So you might, I don't know, you may be calling like assigning a record or winning an opportunity, or there's actions that you can call, and you can create custom one of those. And plugins are a pro code way of creating the operations that are called. And a plugin is special in the sense that, unlike a Power Automate flow, a plugin runs very, very close to the Dataverse database. In fact, so close that it can actually participate in the database transaction. And what that means is that if you are performing a number of different actions inside that plugin, maybe updating 3 or 4 related records, or creating other records, if something goes wrong during those operation inside that transaction, everything will roll back. And they're really, that's really a kind of a unique aspect to the way in which plugins work, because they're so close.
So that was an amazing explanation about plugins. So let's continue on the other automation. So we also have business process flows, where effectively a business process flow is as displayed here, where you can effectively guide your users that are opening a form of a table or an entity. Your business process flow will guide them through a series of stages. So those are kind of the stages and steps, right? So for example, for the case, we could have 3 stages, and then within each we can kind of define steps. So that's what we call business process flows. Next one would be workflow. So we have the classic workflows that we can still leverage in model-driven apps. So classic workflow effectively would be useful, especially for kind of instant automation that you need to have on update of a field or a record. You want instantaneously update or create another record, then you can use those classic workflows. So for example, if I update the subject here with another value, that might update the title of my case, or might instantaneously trigger the creation of another record in the database, right? We can also leverage, of course, Cloudflow in Power Automate. So basically, those are kind of connected mostly to your Dataverse tables, where on update and again on creation update, we can kind of trigger Cloudflows to do additional logic, right? Security. So effectively security, where different features that we can write. So let's start with app access. So you can effectively define the access to a model-driven app at the app access. So you can define security roles where only certain security roles have access to an app. Table access. So in this case, we can define in security roles which tables are accessible by the user that has that security role. So we can effectively hide a whole table with their records within, right? Record access. So each record has an owner, and for each of these, effectively, we can define again security roles where users can only see their own records. They cannot see records of others, or they cannot update records of others. So there is that kind of the record access level for the security. Form access. So as we define those UI elements, you can also define specific forms to be visible only by specific users. So as an admin, maybe I have access to 3 different forms with 3 different UIs, and as a standard user, I can only access one kind of form. And column access, you can also define for each of those columns or fields who has access to see or update those specific columns. Model-driven apps also has some built-in charts and dashboard capabilities. So effectively, you can build, charts within your model-driven apps and display them in dashboard, right? So in this case, that's a dashboard where you can see active cases by the origin. And so the model-driven apps, really charts and dashboards, are kind of simple in a way where they're very easy and rapid to build, but they don't offer you kind of the capabilities and the visualization offered by Power BI. But of course, you can extend your build, or you can extend model-driven apps with additional charting and dashboarding capabilities, leveraging Power BI and having those Power BI dashboards or tiles directly being visible in your model-driven app. Now, let's move on to Canvas apps. So in terms of user interface, Scott, what are the components that we can use in Canvas apps to build a user interface?
Yeah, I mean, it's just it's called Power App Studio, and it's an app designer. So in the same way as a model-driven app, you would edit your app. In the same way as in Canvas, you would edit your app, and then suddenly, but just the designer has got different capabilities rather than building blocks, rather than using model-driven building blocks, which are bound to tables intrinsically. You're using the building blocks, which are data connection agnostic on the whole. You're using building blocks which are more like buttons and text boxes and galleries and repeated items, and PCF controls as well, because you can have those in Canvas. With the overlap in your diagram, in the bit in the middle, the custom pages, that's very simple. It's a Power Apps. It's the Power App Studio editor, same kind of deal. You've got building blocks, which is all buttons, and it's just that it's not an app in itself. It's more of a screen. It's a screen inside a model-driven app. But a screen effectively is the same thing. It's an app. It's just it's housed inside a model-driven app, and it's got a lot more native integration to the things that surround it. So you can navigate around. You can navigate between not model-driven forms and views and custom pages seamlessly, as the user doesn't really understand they're moving. Of course, from a user interface perspective, it does make somewhat of an interesting challenge, because you've got to make your custom page look as close to model-driven apps as you can, or as close as you can make it not jarring for the user, because you don't want the user to move from a model-driven app into a custom page and go, wow, these are different user interfaces. You want to make it as close to make it as seamless, but in reality, you're never going to be able to make a custom page look exactly like a model-driven form. You just have to get it looking so it's not going to be jarring.
Yeah, cool. And in terms of connecting data from Canvas apps, I see a few additional options than Dataverse. So can you walk us through what kind of data you can connect to Canvas natively?
Well, yeah, with Canvas, you've got the whole connection ecosystem. I mean, that's one of the lovely part of Canvas apps is being able to connect to Dataverse, and there's a special affinity these days between Canvas and Dataverse. It didn't always used to be that case, but yeah, there definitely is. They sort of Canvas app favors Dataverse to a certain extent. But yeah, you can connect to you can connect to SharePoint, you can connect to SQL Server, you can connect to data using custom connectors. And again, that's so fantastic for custom pages where this overlap in the middle, because in the past there was just no way of getting out. Well, I mean, yeah, not that there was no way. I mean, there were different alternatives like virtual tables. That was one way, or creating custom integrations and all sorts of different ways of achieving it. But it was costly to maintain, costly to build in the first place, not fully flexible. Whereas now with a custom page, you can just move, and you can now mash up Dataverse data alongside external data and other places.
Yeah. So we covered data, we covered user interface. Anything else? Like let's discuss automation. So automation in Canvas apps.
Well, so like you were saying about where you've got calling out to custom connectors. Obviously, you can call, or calling out to any data connector in custom pages. You can call out to a Power Automate flow. So that then that opens up an even bigger ecosystem interactions. So if you can't do it through a direct integration inside a Power App, inside a Canvas app or a custom page, you can just call a Power Automate flow, and then that goes off and does whatever it needs to do. And there's various different patterns that you can use for that. So if it's a very quick things, you can actually call a Power Automate flow and wait for a response. But more often than not, these things generally take longer than the minute that it will wait. Most HTTP gateways these days have got like a minute timeout. And so if it's going to take a long running process, you want to just do start the process. It's going to run in a Power Automate flow and have some kind of like query mechanism to say, right, how's it going? Monitor it for progress, and then the Power Automate flow updates something to say it's complete, and then you can give the user some feedback. So that's a hugely powerful way of doing things. So creating reports is a good example. So creating like PDF documents. Power Automate flow is great for doing that, automating by going off and getting some data, merging it into a Word document, converting that into a PDF, uploading it to SharePoint, stuff that you automate all through your Power Automate flow. And from the Power app, from the Canvas app, you just call that and then wait for it to finish and doing it, and then you can sort of give the user the URL to open. So that's a great. From another automation, I was talking about custom APIs. If your automation is much more closer to Dataverse, much more, you need more transaction support, you need a lot more native Dataverse type operations, and you might create that custom action and call that inside a custom page or Canvas app.
Cool. And the last two components I had on the diagrams are mixed reality and AI builder. Should we cover those two as well?
It's an interesting. I mean, obviously, AI builder is predates by a long time. All of this excitement we've had with Copilot and things like that. But for sort of classification and predictions of things, it's fantastic, But they're very much like black boxes, right? So you create you train your model, and then you run that model on a particular input, and then you get your response. And so if you need that sort of document classification type operation, you can add it in as a component. I mean, and that's the thing, is it sits there in a component. And the same for augmented reality stuff. You've got a component that sits in there. You give it like your 3D model, and you can do all of the cool augmented reality stuff, or you can just rotate, look at a particular object in 3D. And so if you've got those kind of use cases, and they tend to be kind of more mobile type app use cases, I think, where you're out and about and you're trying to do something, and rather than somebody sitting in a desktop and doing things.
Yeah. Amazing. And let's move on to kind of some components which are, I think, more related to overall Power Apps. Not they are not really model driven or Canvas apps related, but they still fit within that Power Apps ecosystem, right? So
Yeah.
solutions and pipelines and ALM. Can we cover those quickly?
Yeah, definitely. So yeah, you've got them here down at the bottom here and listed.
Yep.
So if you just go in order,
Yeah.
the whole solutions of pipelines and ILM, I think the big thing here is focus was on governance, right? So governance around environments is quite a big deal, and making sure that you you can only connect to the have one particular connector connecting to another connector in one different environment, so you can't have like data leaks, data loss protection, but also governance in terms of making sure looking at what people are doing, all the different environments. And so managed environments is really, I think, the area that is quite important. And what I love about your diagrams here is that although we've got this Venn diagram in the middle with the model-driven apps and the Canvas app and the overlap in the middle, which is very distinct, it's a very important concept. The rest of it is all kind of this sort of fuzzy electron cloud kind of thing going on. The different colors, the purple sort of merging into the green and merging into the yellow and the blue, and it's very much there isn't like a hard line between all these different components. They're all very much open to be used in various different ways across the different surface area. And so solutions underpins the way in which we deploy these components between environments. So if if you've got two environments and you want to export it from one environment into another, that would be a solution. And so solutions sit in Dataverse, right? So
Yeah.
although they kind of are like a model-driven app concept, you also add Canvas apps to solutions. You also add Cloud Automate flows, and and we're starting to get much more support from a Power BI perspective in solutions as well. And so yeah, that's where it's like there's a fuzzy area. But yeah, solutions allow you to move things between environments, between Dataverse environments, and pipelines is a new way of doing that. So it's a way of automating that process of saying, okay, I've got my development environment here, I've got my test environment, and then I've got my production environment. And you can set up a pipeline to say, I will deploy from my development environment. This is the solution I'm going to take, and it'll export it automatically from my development and then import it into my test as a managed solution. And then it will, when I'm ready, I finish testing, I can approve, and it will move to the next stage. And so it just creates a degree of automation. You've got like a nice visual so you can see it, what version is in what environment. And so that's the application lifecycle management aspect.
Yeah.
And they all kind of go hand in hand together. And then with the governance on top of that, it's really starting to create a very joined up way of managing your environments. And I think that's probably the differentiator. And sometimes I think people don't really appreciate how much it gives them, how much compared to maybe doing all this bespoke, just doing pro dev development. I'm just going to deploy all my stuff to Azure, and I'm just going to use some third party, hosting thing. And they forget about all this management layer and the ability to report on what's going on where and what users are doing what in where, and the security that backs that up. And then moving on, then mobile offline, it's another one of these things that people that forget about the benefit you get with going with a Power App. And this applies to both model-driven apps as well, Canvas app. Now, I'd love to have there to be a more of a joined-up way of handling this, because at the moment the offline story for Canvas apps is different to model-driven apps. And so custom pages is this sort of awkward middle ground where you've got a different technique for offline, so it's not very it's not consistent. So hopefully that will be fixed in the future. But yeah, I can go offline with my app and I can have all my data, and then when I connect back online, it then syncs all my data up to Dataverse, and that's huge, because it literally, you just, for model driven apps at least, you just get that mostly for free. It's just a metadata configuration. You just say, make this table available offline, and you give it a profile. For a Canvas app, you've got to do that a little bit. There's more stuff you've got to do. You actually have to code that. You actually have to create data that's stored offline. But it's still an awful lot easier than if you were building a bespoke app. And so lastly, the wrap app, be able to create an app. Again, this is, if you were to create an application, an app, like an iOS app or an Android app, a bespoke one, you might say, well, we're going to deploy that into the app store, the Play Store or whatever. And yes, this is the reason we need to do it bespoke. We can't use Power Apps. Well, actually, with Wrap, what it allows us to do is to take a Power App and create a submission to the App Store and get it approved. Yeah. And so it becomes something that then people can download and then run and authenticate and into the Active Directory and then use it as though it was just a custom app. And I think that's just fantastic, because you've got all the power of the low code and all of that management and the governance I've just been talking about, but just combined with the simplicity of use and the convenience.
Yeah. So on this one, is instead of using the Power Apps mobile client, you use a custom app that exactly. You just right.
And it's just great. It's like a shell, really. It's your own custom shell that you can give it all of that.
Cool. Okay. So now some last questions, some hard ones for the end, right? So now that we covered most of the components of model-driven apps and Canvas apps, in your opinion, Scott, when would you use a model-driven apps versus a Canvas apps?
Well, this is the big question. I think if you ask 10 people, you're probably going to get 10 different answers, to be honest. I mean, lots of people have got different affinities to different types of apps. I mean, they'll see a lot of people who come from the Dynamics 365 world and the CRM world, and they'll say, oh, of course, model-driven apps all the way. And then, of course, a lot of people came into Canvas apps and they're through the Office 365 side of things. So, I think everyone's got their favorite. But there's pros and cons. And my general approach to it is like, well, okay, how far can you get with a model-driven app? And if you can get if you can get over 60% of the way there without any challenges in a model-driven app, then I think that's a very good metric to actually say, well, that's going to provide some value. If you're saying, well, actually our user interface is so bespoke and so specifically it has to be looking at and feel in a particular way, then perhaps a Canvas app is going to suit you better. But of course, what I love about your diagram that you're showing here is the overlap, of course, and that the custom pages is very much that the new way of bringing in Canvas into model. Embedded Canvas apps obviously has been around for a very long time, and that does give you some degree of flexibility. But having custom pages gives you that ability to create functionality that you just couldn't. You can break out of the mold of that model-driven way of looking. Now, a lot of people come from Canvas world, and they create a model-driven app, and they go, hang on a minute. So you mean you're telling me that the view is always going to look like that, and the form is always going to look like that, and some people see that as an advantage, and some people see that as a disadvantage. And I think that ultimately then begs the question, is that if you do say, well, actually, we're going to go down the route of a custom UI using a Canvas app because we have to have our user interface looking just so, the question I think is important to ask early on in the project is, why does it have to look just so? What is it? Is it just because you've got some kind of branding guidelines? And are those branding guidelines taking into consideration the benefits you get from having Model-driven apps create your user interface for you with no effort and consistency, and all of the lower costs of ownership you get from model-driven apps, just building the forms and building the views, and then all the additional stuff you get with that for free, like being able to customize, having user customizable views, and having all of that, the security trimming built in, and all of the functionality that exists around it. So yeah, it's certainly a complicated question, and like I said, it's not an easy one to answer. But yeah, I would say I would start with the user interface and say, is model-driven apps going to get us most of the way there? Certainly more than 50%, ideally more. And if not, why not? That's the question to ask yourself.
Yeah, cool. Thank you. That was an amazing explanation. Scott, model-driven apps, right? I would build a model-driven app starting from a data model first, right? Then I would tweak. I don't have to have the complete data model ready, but I would start at least from some tables, and then I can add, my forms and lists, and kind of start shaping that model-driven app. How is the process of creating a Canvas app? Is it the same? Are you starting again from tables, or is it slightly different? And maybe we can extend on all the components of Canvas apps then.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's interesting that, you start from the table, because I think that's quite usual from a model-driven app for people to start from a table, because obviously, you can't create a form or a view without the table to back it. Exactly. So you can't even create the user interface without there being that table there in the first place. Whereas with a Canvas app, there doesn't need to be any data source to connect to before you create your user interface. You can start to drag things onto the surface, and in fact, you can even create an app, sort of like a prototype, if you like, with a local copy of the data. You don't even need to have a data source. You could just manually create your collections and update those collections. So it acts like a user interface, but just doesn't connect to any data source. However, the challenge with both of those approaches is that even though it's low code, even though we're talking, actually, it's very easy to create, a database table or a form. It's very easy to create a Canvas app page and all the different things, controls on that. If you do need to change it, if you get halfway along that process, there's a lot of unpicking you've got to make. So I'm a big fan of prototyping user interfaces before you hit anything, before you get anywhere near doing something, low code or otherwise. This is what I do when I'm building pro code applications as well. Because it's even more obviously important with pro code applications, because you're making that much more investment in terms of the user interface. A lot more, you have to do a lot more plumbing to get it working. Although there are lots of frameworks that make it easier, like React and Angular and things like that. But nevertheless, the commitment and the investment you're putting into your user interface design can, I find, then suddenly start to influence your willingness to change and adapt as you get feedback from users. And I think it's so important to get early feedback from people, including yourself, including a critical eye yourself. It's like, hey, would I really use this app? Was this really going to be something that I want? And that's so much easier to do in, like, even if you're just doing it in PowerPoint, just dragging boxes onto PowerPoint or on a whiteboard, just sketching it out. I love using Figma. I'm a big fan of Figma. So I've got, I've got Figma templates that I use for all model-driven components and all that kind of stuff. And it's so much quicker to iterate. And what I find is I don't become personally invested in the user interface, because I don't kind of like go, oh, you got any idea how long it took me to do that? I'm not changing it. And so, I because I don't have that personal investment, I'm much willing to go, to delete that and start again, and then do it slightly differently. That's where I start. Irrespective of model driven or Canvas app, I always start with How should the UI look? And then I can best decide. And of course, there are different constraints on both sides. So model-driven app, as you know, you've got constraints in terms of you need to make the table design in a particular way to achieve a particular look and feel. So when you're doing a model-driven app user interface design, you can't do it. You can't just give it to some random designer that doesn't know anything about model-driven apps. You have to have in the back of your mind what are the constraints that you have in terms of model-driven apps. You know that you have to have a form with subgrids. You know your views, and you have a command bar and things like that. And equally with Canvas apps, you know that there are certain constraints, like you can't actually create a UI that has sort of things where you swipe actions or certain interactions, certain ways of navigating, and there are certain things that you just wouldn't do in a Canvas app or a custom page. So you have to have that in mind, but nevertheless you're still looking at it in a bit more of a higher level abstract sense.
Voila, I hope that you liked this video, and if that's the case, please give me a thumbs up. And don't hesitate to subscribe to my channel so that you get notified when I publish new content. I hope to see you in the next one.